Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Howard Ehrman, and I am the moderator for this session. This is the 20th or the 30 years of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Today, we're going to talk about the legislation passed 30 years ago that was called by many the greatest piece of legislation passed in the last 50 years. The ADA was passed on July 26, 1990. Today, we have three distinguished panelists here to talk to us about their experiences with the ADA. We have with us Amy Beck, the Executive Director of the Lehigh Valley Center for Independent Living. Amy has been the Executive Director for the Lehigh Valley SIL for the past 20 years and has a lot of experience in disability and the ADA, especially the history of the Americans with Disabilities Act. We also have Corey Frazier, Executive Director of the Center for Autistic Advocacy. Corey has been the director there for many years, and under their guidance, the Center for Autistic Advocacy has served hundreds of disabled adults in Western and in Central Pennsylvania. Lastly, John Seeley is the Executive Director of the Empowering Lives Foundation. The Empowering Lives Foundation was created in 2016, and John and his wife, Juanita, work with folks helping them discover their talents and their purpose through social experiences in the community. Welcome to all. We're going to start off with Amy. Amy's going to give some historical perspective on the Americans with Disabilities Act. Go ahead, Amy.
Thank you, Howard. Let's see how I do here getting my screen share going. Hopefully this will go well. Okay, I think we've got it. I would like to give you a very brief ADA crash course. I'm calling it ADA 101 to give you a little frame of reference about what we're talking about today. And I trust that most of you are very familiar with the ADA. Just having a little trouble advancing. Oh, I don't know what I'm doing. Let's see. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. Having trouble getting to my next screen. I don't know if my technical people have any suggestions for me. Let me come out of screen share.
Someone is suggesting to try the left and right arrows.
Mm-hmm. And look at that. Right, up, down, left, right. Page up, page down. Let me stop screen share and we'll try again. Maybe if thank you for your patience. Maybe if I go into this mode, then I can switch to from the beginning. Let's see if it'll work for me now. All right, there we go.
There you go.
Okay, so just a little history. There was, of course, a lot of legislation about people's rights leading up to the ADA. I wanted to point out that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not actually protect people directly because of a disability. It only would have protected people in relationship to race or ethnic origin, et cetera. However, the civil rights movement did start the independent living movement, which is very important to people with disabilities. And that's a whole day conference. I'm not gonna talk about the independent living movement, but it is important. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which I know many of you have heard of, that did impact those with disabilities, but it only applied in terms of how it related to federal or state programs. So that left most of the lives of people with disabilities without any protections. How and why did the ADA emerge? So it came about after centuries of marginalization. Advocates finally fought collectively, collectively being a key word. Efforts came together. Came about because people with disabilities were tired of discrimination. People with disabilities had had a lack of equality in employment, travel, access to public places, you name it. It also was a result of decades of hard work by advocates. It wasn't just a 1 or 2 year process, but a multi-year battle. And people with disabilities finally started labeling what was happening as discrimination. So I just wanted to point out a few other key pieces of information. The movement to create, write, and pass the ADA was, if I'm allowed to use the term in this day and age, bipartisan, meaning that people from both major parties worked together to make it happen. Big business bought the ADA. Some of us can remember big business was saying that the ADA would cripple the economy, businesses wouldn't be able to handle the cost, which all turned out to not be true. But, the ADA was signed into law on what I affectionately call ADA Day, July 26, 1990. Really importantly, and it deserves 3 hours in a lecture, but the ADA created a class, that is people with disabilities, and that's very significant. And just to note that, you know, legislation, long-term legislation will change. There was a revision that was effective in early 2009. So I'm just going to go over very quickly the 5 titles of the ADA. There's 5 areas it covers. Title I covers employment. It gives the same employment opportunities and benefits to people with disabilities as to their non-disabled counterparts. It identifies the right to a reasonable accommodation in terms of employment, which is very significant. The ADA in employment practices applies to private employers with 15 or more employees. The employment issues around the ADA are governed by the United States EEOC. And it also does apply to labor organizations and employment agencies. So they have to follow the ADA as well. Next, Title II. Title II, it covers state and local government. It addresses areas that were not as well covered or clarifies parts of the Rehab Act of 1973. It provides equal rights in programs, activities, and services of public entities. So county government, state government, government programs. It gives clarification about transportation, access, and the right to use public transportation, which I will say I'm a person with a physical disability. That's very significant to me that I could access public transportation. And the Department of Justice enforces Title II. I would like to say in respect to the Department of Justice that there always appears to be many more complaints than there are staff. So there has been a good spell where I feel things moved a little more quickly, but I had personal experience watching a class action situation that took over 5 years for the DOJ to make a decision. Title III, public accommodations. This is the big one for those of us with disabilities. This really covers all of those other things in life. So any private place where the public is welcome falls under Title III. So I just gave you a few examples there. Think of restaurants, stores, medical offices, daycare, movies, hotels. It gave minimum standards for access. You know, here are the measurements of what it means to be accessible, and also explains what was required for barrier removal. The very busy Department of Justice also enforces Title II, Title III. And then Title IV, that covers telecommunications, a rapidly changing area, but this requires telephone companies to provide relay services that's both inter and intrastate, requires closed captioning of federally funded announcements, such as a news announcement coming from a federal entity. I want to say that the right to have equal communication falls under Title III, and that would cover sign language interpreters. And also Title IV, it makes sense. It's enforced by the FCC. Title V, that's our fifth area of the ADA. That covers miscellaneous things. It usually relates to the ADA as a whole. It addresses other laws and how they interact with the ADA. It talks about state immunity, insurance providers, and retaliation. And it does actually define some conditions or characteristics that the law has determined are not considered disabilities. So it also importantly tells people how they can have legal recourse if they feel their rights are being violated in general. So that was our crash course on the ADA. And now I'm going to stop screen sharing and we're going to be, if I can do this right, and be back to the full group. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. For the next part of our program, before we get started, I wanted to let everyone know that if you have questions of any of our panelists, please put them in the chat box. We're going to try to answer them as they come up and as we have time. So please put your questions in the chat box. Now I have a series of questions that I want to ask our panelists to get some more information on their experiences with the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm going to start with Corey. What does your organization do and how does the ADA support that work?
So the Pittsburgh Center for Autistic Advocacy does work to get disabled people in Allegheny County and surrounding communities what they need through innovative resource coordination, peer support, and systems on legislative advocacy. We ourselves are autistic and disabled experts and social workers supporting disabled and autistic people. And we use our lived experience with the ADA, with systems of support, as well as our expertise and our experience of other protections for disabled people to supplement our work. And the ADA plays a really big part in that because it is something we run into so frequently in terms of disability discrimination with our clients, whether that's accessing support at a doctor's office or curb cuts at the end of their street to be able to cross the street and move around the world independently. I think the ADA is a really big, tool for us in getting our clients what they need.
Thank you. John, I'm going to ask you the same question. What does your organization do and how does the ADA support the work that you do?
So we're a little broader than just housing. It's funny, when we started, we're focused on employment, but we found out when people got employed, they wanted to then live on their own and they wanted to socialize. So now we're kind of an umbrella all about helping people to, discover what their purpose and talents are and live connected lives in their community. And we base it all around social experiences. So since this is about housing, we support folks who live on their own and folks who want to live on their own. And so we work with them the folks, the younger people that want to live on their own, we work with them, what's important to you for living there and how do you want to live in, and what kind of a housing do you want to live in? And then when you start looking at landlords specifically, a lot of them don't understand all the ADA. Some of it, they don't know that it's available, and some of it they think it's too restrictive. So sometimes it's educating landlords on the support the ADA gives to both landlord and to the tenant. And it's also about the tenants knowing that they have rights and what they can ask for is a reasonable accommodation, and kind of getting the two of them to talk together. So we do a lot of that. We do a lot of educating, especially young people. We support folks that are, 15 up to our oldest team member is 78. So, but a lot of the younger 20 somethings, they don't they don't know about this. They've lived with mom and dad, or they've been told a lot of bad information, honestly, stuff that's just outdated and that's not accurate. They don't realize it of the choices and the options that are available to them, whether it's in housing or even in employment and in recreation. So, we tend to do a lot of educating on that, and the ADA helps us. And we could probably do better by teaching more about ADA, but we kind of use the bits and pieces we need to when people need to have things that relate to them.
Thanks, John. Amy, what what does your organization do, and how does it supported by ADA?
Sure. LVCIL stands for Lehigh Valley Center for Independent Living, and we are one of 17 centers for independent living across the state. And for all CILs, we are very much tied to the ADA because we are disability rights organization. We are run by a majority of board members and staff who have life experience with disability. So we find ourselves providing education frequently, helping people learn about what their rights are under the ADA. We've helped many people learn about how to file a complaint and have followed people through the complaint process. It's wonderful to see someone who was treated badly get their rights heard and to have a final action based on what they do. We had a young adult years back who wanted to visit a nightclub in the Lehigh Valley, and he happened to use a motorized wheelchair and a speech device, and he was not allowed in. And he had made arrangements, transportation, he had his ID, he had his money. And what a shameful action for that public place. And because of the ADA, his complaint was heard, and what he wanted from them was that they would change their policies and practices and post a notice that all people were welcome there. And he got it. He got his positive resolution. So, the ADA is through all that we do. We do ADA site surveys. We do a lot of education in the community on not only the ADA, but disability sensitivity. And really all centers for independent living are multi-service providers that are really experts about people with all types of disabilities. So I like to say ADA are us.
Very good. Thank you. This is a question that I'm going to pose to all three of you. For those of you who were in the fight for the ADA, what are some of the experiences that you can share about that? And for those of you who are came in it a little later, there have been many attacks on the ADA over the years. What role did you play in trying to make sure that the ADA stays intact and actually strengthens? We'll start with John.
Well, I wasn't involved at the time, so I came in kind of late to the party. But we, what we do now is we do a lot of advocacy. Actually, just before this, I was on a phone call with legislatures about the upcoming new Congress and the priorities there. There's a lot of advocacy. There's a lot of education. It's not just educating, like I mentioned before, the young people who we work with. Nobody teaches this to them in school, really. And if it's done, it doesn't land on them just hearing it one time. So you're teaching them that they have the rights, and the ADA is there to back them up for that. And then actually putting that into action and going and talking to like the nightclub that she just talked about. I mean, I think you've got to educate. Most businesses want to do the right thing. They don't always know what that is. And if they do, they don't always know how to do it. They overcomplicate it. So it could be as simple, like she said, as posting a sign that everybody's welcome and educating your staff. We've done some staff trainings for, we did it for a gym here in town that was not sure how to work with somebody who was coming in on their own to work out. And they thought they needed to come with a support person. And our whole goal was to get them to go on their own. So we went and educated the staff about, different people's needs and how they could help people. And they were very, very thankful for that. I think that all goes back to ADA. ADA took us to a level, right? But we got to take that to the next level. As with anything, I mean, that's really one of the whole basis. Juanita and I started this because we have a son with Down syndrome, school was great, but parents before us fought for that to happen. And we now, and the people we support, need to take this to the next level so that they're fully included, united in their community, which doesn't happen in employment and housing. And a lot of that is by talking to legislators, advocating and educating business leaders so that they know that, everybody has the abilities to do everything. They just might need some help. The other big thing right now is technology. And, we used to have to go buy, right, Dynavoxes and all these special equipment, but now, I can use an iPhone or a Google Dot and do a ton of things with it. And so I think using the technology that's available, honestly, at Best Buy and advocating for that use to let people live on their own so they have support as and when and how they need it is really the difference maker.
Okay, Corey, same question to you. What, go ahead.
Okay, so as I talked about, like as we were preparing this, I was born the year after the ADA passed, and I've been told I'm the ADA generation. Even though, the first time my disabilities were diagnosed, I was about 6 years old. I'm just reflecting a little bit that I didn't know what my rights were as a disabled person until after I graduated college. And so one of the really big things we've done is doing a lot of education within the community of people with developmental disabilities, as well as at some of the local institutes of higher education, as well as advocacy, working with our legislators, working with some of our other electeds and appointed boards on how we're thinking about disability and the ADA, as well as like doing some direct mediation between disabled people and their employers or public accommodations. And one of the things I think we don't talk a lot about is direct action. I've been involved almost every year for the past 5 or 6 years in Pittsburgh celebration of the ADA, which I think also gives us a time to demand better, demand more teeth, more action, more of the things that the ADA is supposed to give us that have not in the past, in my lifetime, even been fully realized.
All right, thank you very much. Amy, could you talk to us about your experiences with fighting for the ADA and in
Sure.
the community interest?
Sure. I came to volunteer on the board at LBCIL in 1990, right before the ADA was signed. Our agency was actually founded in June. The ADA was signed a few weeks later. So while I wasn't part of the groundwork, I have a great respect for all of our friends and foremothers, forefathers who fought for us. They crawled up the steps of the Capitol, they camped out, they held vigils, and many groups have continued to take action over issues that my esteemed colleagues have been mentioning because, the ADA isn't where it needs to be yet. But I think you have to look at the ADA as a living thing, and as the world is very different now than it was in 1990. And I keep thinking the telecommunications really portion of the ADA probably needs an update, on a every 1 or 2 year basis because as John was saying, a cell phone now can take the place of 5 pieces of equipment someone used to have. So and also to Corey's point, we do have to take action. We do have to recognize anniversaries like having this session. It's very significant and it's a chance to say what's been working, what's still not so good, and how are we going to change that?
All right, thank you. Again, this question is going to be for all of you. What disability challenges have been increased due to COVID regarding housing discrimination? Have you had any experiences with violations with landlords, exiting clients from housing programs, supported housing during the pandemic, such as rapid rehousing. Has there been any issues from any of you in regard to housing and COVID for people with disabilities? Go ahead, Amy.
Well, I can jump in. One of our services is housing, counseling, and search support. And we've dealt with many consumers who have that fear of losing their housing when the family member has lost employment. So for the most part, because of extensions on the legislation keeping people from being able to evict people, we've been able to keep people in housing. But there have been some scenarios, and you know, some landlords have been very panicky because of the pandemic, like many people overall have been. But fortunately, we have a good network in the Lehigh Valley. Our local RHAB can help people expedite housing issues. We are very worried about what is going to happen when those eviction stays are over. And I do want to say that for some centers for independent living, what they've done on a remarkable level tied into this is they've helped people who wanted to leave nursing homes get into temporary then permanent housing. Some centers for independent living had some federal funds, some special funds that have been able to divert people out of nursing homes, which has been very powerful given the death rates for people living in congregate settings. So that's been very significant.
Okay, thank you.
I'll jump in too.
Go ahead, John.
I think I don't think we've seen as much of a problem with housing. I agree with what Amy said. There's a huge problem about, you know, when those moratoriums come up and what's going to happen. And luckily, we've seen here some landlords get some funding federally that helped cover some of that. So I think that's really, really good. The bigger thing I've seen is a food disparity. You know, people not having access to be able to get food, whether it's, hey, I have SNAP benefits or I have my EBT card, but I'm at risk. I don't want to go to the grocery store and they won't let me use my EBT card for curbside pickup and for delivery. Now that's gotten better, but that should just be automatic. It shouldn't be if this store does it or that store does it. It should be available every place. And that's something that hasn't happened yet. This still needs to happen. And I think that's been a problem. I think people also not having access to be able to get even food. We've helped a lot of people with that. I think the technology gap is really shown during COVID for people because a lot of folks, you know, they live on a fixed income. They might not have internet. So I think as we move forward, we should look at housing projects that include internet as part of the rent. It's ridiculous in some of these HUD finance housing facilities. You know, their complexes, they could Wi-Fi the whole place and provide it as part of the rent. And then everybody have access to the technology they need to live their lives into and to stay connected during a time like COVID. So I think those are the things that really came out during COVID. And then the other thing, which isn't really housing, but now we're looking at the vaccination process, and people still don't have the good answers about when does everyone with a disability get their vaccination. You know, we've heard that direct support workers now are part of 1A. That's fantastic. But what and people who get an ODP waiver are part of 1B. But what if you get an OTL waiver, an OMSAS, or what if you don't have any support, but you still have a physical or intellectual disability? You're still more at risk, and you should be in those higher categories. And nobody, county, federal, state, have the answers to that at this point. And so I think that's a real problem right now.
Go ahead, Corey.
I'd also say we haven't seen disability discrimination per se increase. One of the things that we have seen is in the past year, just a dramatic slowdown of systems. For example, I'm thinking of a gentleman that we met last year who had been living in a hotel using his entire SSDI check to pay for it for 8 months. And to see, you know, we found a housing placement and then community health choices didn't approve the hours of housing support that he needed. And then he had a year living in a hotel. And it's just now, this past weekend, that he moved into independent housing because all of these systems are slowed down in their communication together, especially for folks who aren't getting traditional HCBS and waivers. All of these little piecemeal systems talking together just is dramatically slowing down getting people into stable housing situations.
All right, thank you very much, Corey. Going forward, what are some of the ideas that you have to strengthen the ADA to improve the quality of lives for the people that you serve? We'll start with John.
There you go. I'm sorry, I was muted again. I think strengthen the ADA, like Amy mentioned, I agree. Technology needs to be something that we need to be current with. It changes every year. I also think the ADA does a lot for, and it was focused on physical disabilities, but there's a lot of intellectual disabilities that they could cover through some ADA aspects as well. And then educating people better, both people with a disability and people without a disability, because I know a lot of business owners, they hear ADA and they get all worried that it's going to cost them a lot of money and it's going to do things that's really not that complicated. It can be simple. It just needs to be fair and equitable for everybody. And I think we need to, educate people on that better.
Corey, your thoughts.
Okay, so I mean, I have a list, gonna be honest. But the first thing is we need teeth. Civil rights legislation that's largely enforced by expensive litigation because the Department of Justice just really isn't giving ADA complaints their due attention and funding. We need some kind of teeth. This is a civil rights law. We should enforce it like a civil rights law. And then I think we also need to look at disability marriage equality. Now that we largely have LGBT and queer disability marriage equality, disabled people are the last people who really don't have it. If you don't know that there's an asset limit whenever people who get SSI payments, if we want to get married, it goes from $2,000 an individual to $3,000 for a family. And that in this world is just not realistic. And beyond that, if both partners don't have SSI, then one of the partners, if they make over the income cap, the partner who gets medical assistant can lose that and lose their waiver services and community engagement and all of the things that keep them alive and healthy and having a quality of life. I think we also need to think, when we go to the doctors, there's often these signs about interpretation being available or braille material, and that is fantastic, and we need that to be happening. But the idea of plain language information for people with developmental and reading disabilities seems to be novel in a lot of places, and I think that's just not acceptable. We need to understand that plain language, keeping things, around a 3rd to 5th grade reading level, so everybody who can read can understand what's happening, is really important. We also need to really acknowledge the way that intersecting, identities affect the lives of disabled people and our experience of disability discrimination. The experience of those with developmental disabilities, those of us who are queer, LGBT, and Black and Indigenous people of color, we have this particularly complex relationship with both the experience of discrimination and oppression and the systems that purport to protect us. And we really need to address how we think about identity and discrimination, as well as that process for remediation of discrimination allegations and how we can actually really be serving the whole community and not primarily white, neurotypical, cis and heterosexual people.
Thank you. Amy?
Yeah, I would just add to the good thoughts put forward that, you know, I've often talked about the fact that we need ADA police to come and deal with those infractions that happen all the time. You know, when you try to go into a Dunkin' Donut with your service animal and you're told dogs aren't allowed and you try to educate the people, you know, there needs to be a way to get a response that could be more swift so that you could get your coffee with your service animal helping you. When you have, you know, accessible parking violations, typically because law enforcement has so much to do with limited time, it's not a number one thing to dispatch police officers to. So, you know, you and your, I have a van that the side opens up and a ramp comes out. And if I was at the movies by myself and come out and I'm parked in, I guess I got to wait for that next feature to show. And there really isn't much recourse, where I feel in other areas of day-to-day life, you would get immediate recourse and resolution. So the ADA did not give money to law enforcement to enforce it. You know, we've talked about the DOJ, you know, and EEOC moving slowly through cases. Typically, the only way you really make a change with the ADA is if there are repeat cases or cases that rise up. So it at times has been harder to create change where there were some weaknesses in the act. So I think I would, you know, like to have an ADA police force, as unrealistic as that sounds. I just wish there was a more expeditious way to deal with those issues. The other area I just want to say that the hardest thing to change, I feel, are all of the fallacious and inaccurate beliefs that people have about those of us with disabilities. I actually had an employer once ask me if I was contagious, could they catch my muscle disease, you know, and that it's just in my life, the lives of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people with disabilities. It's the ADA has, for example, improved physical access across our communities, but the ADA itself cannot change the attitude, the prejudices that people have. And that sometimes takes some generations changing, but in one respect, because the ADA has made it easier for people with disabilities to be out and about in the community is more used to there being people with disabilities, thereby affecting some greater familiarity. But we still have some stigma work to do.
Thank you, Amy.
Yeah, I think, Howard, if you look there, there's a common thread. I mean, they're absolutely right. We need more teeth in this, but we also need to educate better. I guarantee I go to every police officer, every police agency here in the county, and none of them are going to really say they enforce anything on ADA. They're not going to help her when her car's blocked in. I mean, they're going to do what they can, but nobody's really knowledgeable about that. They're going to say it's a legal matter. Go to the justice system and do it, which takes years and years to get done. And I think that's something that's missing and that everybody's kind of alluded to here.
All very good points, and I'm in total agreement with those comments. John. A question has been posed. The Department of Justice has been investigating a number of developers, managers on violations of finished communities with regard to differences in design and actual construction. Does anybody have any insights on how the Department of Justice targets whom they inspect?
I mean, I can offer that. I know at times through LBCIL, we've been contacted by governing agencies. It might be Human Relations Commission, but it relates to, you know, hey, we'd like you to help participate in, you know, going to some different communities, applying for housing there, such as a 55 and over community. I don't know exactly for the DOJ, I assume it's similar in that. But in our region, we have over the years had quite a few nefarious practices discovered and have been a little bit helped through that process.
Corey, do you have any insights on? No. John?
I mean, so I spent 32 years in private business before we started doing this. And I know that a lot of times, things will get changed. And then when it happens, when somebody comes back and looks at they explain it, but they don't ever correct it. And so I think that's a problem. I don't know how they target people. My guess is, from what I've seen here and in Connecticut and other places where we worked, if somebody complains about it, they go in and do an investigation and look at it. So it's somebody found that complaint to look at it. But I think a lot of times things get looked the other way. I don't know why we still build so many stairs. Why do we still build so many stairs? There's a lot of people that have trouble with stairs. Seems like we should have more ramps, but they're just not built in.
Again, this is a question for all of you. If you had a bucket list, what changes or improvements would you hope for the ADA over the next 30 years? Start with Corey.
So we need to get those teeth. And then we also need to, I think everybody has said it, and I think it's really important. We need to address technology in online spaces in a really meaningful way. I think especially the history of the autistic rights movement, a lot of the organizing that went on for autistic people to demand to get our needs met in service systems and in legislation has happened online. So it is really important, especially in a time of COVID-19, that we address online spaces in a really meaningful way. And we also need to look at some of the exceptions in the ADA in terms of removing exceptions for small businesses and exceptions where contract workers can't get reasonable accommodations to do their work, as well as exceptions for insurance companies. It's really beyond me why, we have to worry about pre-existing conditions and use the ACA for that whenever it seems to really intuitively fit into a place in the ADA as well. So I think there are a lot of things. We could also use the ADA and particularly the Olmstead decision of 1999 to continue understanding disabled people's right to live in the community and continue the deinstitutionalization that's gone on for the last 50 years. And finally actually finish it, because we know it is cheaper. We know that it is more effective, that people have a better quality of life if they live in the community and get their services there.
Amy, go ahead and same question to you.
Sure, I did talk some about my hopes previously, but I would hope that in 30 years from now, when this conference is happening, that we aren't dealing with situations, the day-to-day discrimination that happens to people with disabilities. For example, I'd like to see that people with disabilities who wish to work are employed at the same rate as people who do not have a disability. That was a big one for me. I would like to see Title I really do its job getting people with disabilities employed. I continue to hope that, it's related through fair housing, but that more housing options will be open. Maybe future versions of the ADA will have some more grit in it relating to housing. And if I'm going to be dreaming, I wish that visitability principles would come into regular construction. And if our audience has not heard of visitability, that means in new construction that owned and rental housing should, every unit, every home should have some elements that make it visible. That means, one accessible entrance, one, level entrance, one area where for living, enough space for living in that area, and a bathroom that could be enlarged if needed to, or be large enough for someone with a wheelchair to be in there. People would like to, live in their homes. No one dreams of growing up and leaving their home to live in an institution. So I would like to see actions keep happening across the board to make a full life experience inclusive for people with all types of disabilities.
All right, thank you, Amy. The next question I have is, how does the ADA affect housing for people with disabilities? And what complementary legislation or protections exist to protect people that address housing for people with disabilities? Go ahead, Corey.
Okay, so in terms of the ADA, primarily it really only affects the part of the residence if it is used as also a public accommodation. So say a massage therapist has part of their home where they provide massage therapy services, then it's a public accommodation and goes into that part of the ADA. But otherwise, it mostly does not affect housing. It's mostly the Fair Housing Act, which explicitly prohibits disability discrimination. We do see some protections from the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, but that's primarily if a landlord is getting HUD funding or like, public housing where it is explicitly HUD funded. We also see some protections like on the really like hyper local level in terms of like local commissions on human relations. Like in the future, I really hope we'll see a whole lot more of things like money follows the person, where we see the money that is used to incarcerate someone in an institution, to follow them to the community to provide services and make sure that their housing is accessible there. And like the Disability Integration Act, which, like I said before, when talking about Olmstead, looks more at deinstitutionalization and community homes and protecting people's right to live in the community.
Thank you. Amy, your response to this question?
Sure. I love what Corey said, and I agree. I would love to see more housing developed with a higher level. Let's exceed the bare minimum of what's required, like for example, in rental housing regarding number of units. More units could easily be made visitable so that people have more options. People can age in place. There could be more to the Fair Housing Act. And I also would love to see, there are a lot of agencies that really work with people to fight for their rights with landlords and fight, for tenants' rights. And I think I'd love to see those organizations such as Legal Services continue. It's definitely necessary. And, we just want more and diverse housing options developed. People with disabilities have all kinds of likes and needs and tastes. I also love mixed housing options. There are new construction thoughts and some happening mixed housing where people of different incomes are in the same building. There may be some people there with disabilities, some people there who don't have disabilities. That is a blended, non-segregated housing option. And I would love all of us to move away from thinking about housing for people with disabilities as only being segregated. That is, all people with disabilities living in the same place, because, we're really all just people and we belong with people with our shared interests in the communities that we like, where there are activities we like. So bring some more options.
John, your thoughts?
I mean, I think Amy articulated it really well, but I think, we do need to move beyond. ADA needs to be in all legislation. It can't just be in the one act. We need to make that a part of our life and our community. We've talked about marriage. We've talked about taxes. We've talked about, all these different things. They all need to work together. And that's really what ADA was, a baseline. And I think that the people who put it together never meant this to be the one encompassing legislation. Like she said, it was a living document that needs to go beyond it. And it needs to make everything fair and equitable to each segment of our lives. And we need to collaborate amongst all different disability groups. and not just make things so they're just by one group or the other. They need to be, together we have strength and we can make that all happen together. And I think that's, where we look at going forward with this and how it affects housing, but nothing is its own silo because we're all in communities. So housing, employment, recreation, they all need to go together. And ADA kind of bonded that in a physical way, but we need to take it beyond that now to really encompass everything. And I would hope that in 30 years from now, we do that it's part of just the culture, and we've lost all the other stereotypes and norms, and we've got to a place where everybody is seen for who and what they are.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about Olmsted, since it is a piece of legislation that was born out of the Americans with Disabilities Act and ties directly to housing. What do you think needs to happen in the next 30 years to strengthen Olmsted to allow people with disabilities to move out and be integrated into the community? And we'll start with Amy.
Well, in Pennsylvania right now, we refer to the monies that you use to live outside of the nursing home as a waiver from living in institution. And we have to reverse that. You should have to have the exception to move into institutional living, not to be in your community of choice. And, states have struggled to comply with Olmsted. It's so much easier right now in Pennsylvania. If you are, let's say you're in the hospital, you've got a change in your disability, it is so easy to get into that nursing home. Not so easy to get your home and community-based services set up or modifications. Like we've had some improvements over the years, but it is still not easy enough in most cases. So we really need, Corey talked about money follows the person. We need that waiver to be for getting in the nursing home. Let's make that hard, or at the facility. Let's make it easier to live in your own community with supports, which is much more cost effective.
Corey?
So if folks aren't completely familiar with the Olmsted decision, it was women with mental health and intellectual disabilities went to the Supreme Court to basically argue that their right to live in the community, if they can be supported there, is protected by the ADA. And the court found that it was in 1999. And we need to use the Olmsted Act and we need to fund it, or not Olmsted Act, excuse me, Olmsted decision. Right now in Pennsylvania, we have 12,361 people on the waiver waiting list. If we have agreed at the level of the Supreme Court that people have the right to live supported in the community, then there should not be a waiting list. There can't be a waiting list. And we have an untold number more waiting. Often we meet people as they go to jail because those supports aren't there, and those rights are being violated by the system, and we have to change that and use it and fund it.
All right, thank you. Are there any questions from anyone in the audience? No questions at this time. Well, I think we all agree that the Americans with Disabilities Act is an important piece of legislation to people with disabilities and the community at large. It is my hope that it strengthens and creates more access to all people with disabilities in the near future. I wanted to thank all of the panelists and thank you for your participation, and have a good day. Thank you.